I'm just connecting. Great. All right, we are recording. All right, I'm Rachel Donito, and I'm here with Sarah Stoeckl, the Assistant Director of the Office of Sustainability at the University of Oregon. This is our third workshop for the NEH Global Public Humanities grant, and I'm going to just briefly introduce Sarah and then turn things over to her. Sarah is the Assistant Director of the Office of Sustainability at the University of Oregon. She manages the Office's academic, co-curricular, and community outreach and engagement programming. Her work includes directing the Environmental Leaders Academic Residential Community, managing the Sustainability Fellows Program for faculty interested in community-engaged learning and research, planning the annual Campus Sustainability Awards, overseeing the Office's outreach and education team, and a range of collaborative partnerships with faculty, staff, programs, and community groups. Sarah earned her PhD in literature from UO, she's a duck, and her research focused on how narratives after the First World War manifested but failed to resolve the conflict's trauma and grief. And she has since extended that overarching curiosity about the cultural and effective consequences of rupture, change, and traumatic events to her passionate work on climate crisis and social injustice. So thank you very much, Sarah, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hi to everybody who's watching, and thank you to Professor Donito for inviting me to talk about community engaged learning and participatory action research. It's a subject that I'm really passionate about and really love supporting others and bringing to life. I'll add, I use she, her pronouns, and I've been at the University of Oregon in my role for just over 5 years. So it's just been a really awesome position to get to be in, to work on sustainability topics, but get to work with faculty, staff, students, and community partners as well. I did want to begin with the University of Oregon's official land acknowledgement, recognizing that land acknowledgements are an important first step, but not a final step. But it is important also sort of as the institution to recognize the land that we are on. So this is the official acknowledgement. The University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, Kalapuya descendants are primarily citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and they continue to make important contributions to their communities, to the UO, to Oregon, and to the world. In following the Indigenous Protocol of acknowledging the original people of the land we occupy, we also extend our respect to the 9 federally recognized Indigenous nations of Oregon, the Burns Paiute Tribe, the Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, the Coquille Indian Tribe, the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians, and the Klamath tribes. We express our respect to the many more tribes who have ancestral connections to this territory, as well as to all other displaced Indigenous peoples who call Oregon home. And then this is not part of the university's official language, but I want to also add a recognition of Oregon's racist and overtly white supremacist history, which was designed specifically to disenfranchise Black people and the ongoing impacts of that racism, violence, and exclusion. And I think I want to add a note here about sort of what the value of doing this land acknowledgement practice is. One is as a representation of the institution that the University of Oregon as an institutional body is on stolen land, and that is an invitation to reflection. The one is reminding non-Indigenous people of whose land we are on and the violence and faith breaking that made our current system. But also third, it's an important way of honoring the generations of care Indigenous people have given to this place and continue to give to it. So building from there, I just want to share what sort of the goals for this workshop are. The first is to distinguish between service learning, this kind of more traditional model, and newer, more robust models of community engaged learning and participatory action research, or PAR, which I'll refer to throughout the presentation. The second is to recognize some approaches to doing community engaged learning in PAR, and the emphasis of a lot of folks I work with is on economic dignity and shaping just futures. And then the third is to understand the resources available on the Partnership Pedagogy site and how to access them. I'll be talking about that later on as well. So starting out, I think it's useful sort of to get on the same page about definitions, at least so that when I say things, you know what I mean about them, or what I mean when I say them. And so the first bit is sort of talking about what is community engaged learning in PAR and what are they not. So I mentioned this idea of service learning as being this a more traditional model that has fallen out of favor a little bit in recent years. It sort of used to be this idea that it was really valuable for students essentially to volunteer, to go out to a site, to go out to a community and do volunteer projects as an aspect of a classroom requirement or sometimes a co-curricular requirement. But there are some challenges and imperfections with this model. So a couple of them come from Tamara Williams and Erin McKenna in an article titled Negotiating Subject Positions in a Service Learning Context Toward a Feminist Critique of Experiential Learning. And one thing they underscore in that article is they say, if, for example, predominantly white upper middle class students are only exposed to Latino men in jail, or to African American women in a women's shelter, or to gay men in an AIDS hospice, or to the poor in the lines of a soup kitchen, there is a real risk of affirming pre-existing stereotypical views. A course with an experiential component can yield a situation where prejudicial perceptions of privilege and power are fortified and enhanced by an experience made legitimate by a given academic course of study. So the point here is that good intentions can actually backfire and reinforce stereotypes that some students might have about certain communities. The other thing that Williams and McKenna talk about in that article is for students where one or more of their identities intersects with the community being volunteered with, can also have a really alienating and disconnecting experience by being told to go, have us volunteer for them when them is also us. And that also then sort of breaks them away from their learning experience and can alienate them from the college experience overall. So there's sort of these two competing challenges with this model. I will also just note that in general, it tends to be a less robust and engaging learning experience for students. It tends to be more simplistic. And so that is why I usually encourage folks towards community engaged learning, which is a deeper, more robust and more partnership project-based mode of engaging students in work with community partners. And so this definition comes from the partnership pedagogy site that I mentioned. And it is that community engaged learning leverages the resources of higher education, including the intellectual labor of students and faculty, to fulfill community partner needs. Similar to service learning, community engaged learning connects classroom theory to real world context, but it often builds rich professional skills such as project management, professional communication, client engagement, collaboration, research, and more. The pedagogy of community engaged learning also emphasizes reflection so that students themselves connect the experience to the theory and also to their own experience, assumptions, and evolving understanding of the material and the world. And so when I'm supporting people and talking with people about doing this kind of learning, one of the first things that I always really emphasize is that this needs to be non-extractive. It needs to be done in partnership with one or more community partners based on them identifying their problems, their pain points, their needs, and crafting projects that support their goals and give them something of value. And so it is not just sort of popping in and asking for labor or expertise or engagement that only serves the classroom or only serves the research project. And that's a really important component of thinking about this kind of work. And then the other thing, kind of as I mentioned, as I segued, it's generally when it's sort of project-based and has real-world impacts, it's a much more robust and professionalizing experience for students than simply volunteering alone would be. And then transitioning from there to what is often an even deeper engagement is participatory action research, where it is a faculty member, possibly a research group, doing a deep research project, again, in collaboration with a community partner. And so from this, I think it's sort of like a textbook called Participatory Action Research, Fran Baum, Colin McDougall, and Daniel Smith write that PAR seeks to understand and improve the world by changing it. At its heart is collective, self-reflective inquiry that researchers and participants undertake so they can understand and improve upon the practices in which they participate and the situations in which they find themselves. The reflective process is directly linked to action, influenced by understanding of history, culture, and local context, and embedded in social relationships. The process of PAR should be empowering and lead to people having increased control over their lives. And so, again, this needs to be non-extractive. It needs to be based in real partnership and grounded in work that is really valuable for the community partners themselves. I think if you're kind of thinking about, or you're interested in both of these modes and you're interested in how to get started, one option would be to actually start with the community engaged learning piece and let that be a lower lift way to start building this relationship with a partner. The opposite can be true. Perhaps you build a really robust research collaborative relationship that then leads to things that you can bring into your classroom and engagement with this partner. So these two things can also complement each other really well if you want to bring them together. The other thing I like to note about this is that both of these, community engaged learning and PAR, are relationship oriented work, which means that they're hard, they're complicated, and they take time because that's how people are. And so think of this as long-term relationship building work, not as something that's just for one quarter or one semester, but something that is going to take a little bit of time to get off the ground and to make rich and to develop over time. Which leads to my last point about this. For pre-tenure, tenure track faculty, this is something that to think about deeply when you want to engage in this kind of work. Because it's not going to result in 5 quick publications for your CV, for your tenure file. It just takes more time than that. It's a little more rich than that. And community partners, even when they're in relationship with you and they like you, they don't care if you get a journal article published. That's not why they're doing this work with you. And so if you are interested in doing this work when you're pre-tenure, I would say, one, be in close conversation with your department head and your mentors and getting their advice, but also laying the groundwork for why this work is valuable. As well, if you're pre-tenure, you might think about what are the lower lift options that start building a longer term relationship that you can then go deeper on once you've made tenure. So that could be another way of thinking about this of, okay, I want to build this relationship. I'm going to start with some smaller things over these couple of years with the idea that I'll have more bandwidth for a more robust thing when I'm not trying to make tenure. And then the other thing is that there are several people at the UO, and I'm sure other institutions as well, that are trying to bang the drum for better recognition for this work in promotion and tenure reviews, for recognition of the impact of it, of the value to students, of the real world impacts, but also of the time it takes, that the products that come out of this are real, robust, rigorous research, even if they aren't traditional journal articles or monographs. So there are folks who have your back and are trying to push this forward, but think about self-advocacy as well and sort of planning in that phase. So I kind of want to transition to just giving some examples of this kind of work to hopefully be a little bit inspirational or spark some ideas about what's possible. So the first one is from a group called Research Action Design, or RAD, based out of Boston. And they are a consulting firm that does PAR projects. That's what they do. So this first one is from the SE Justice Group and RAD. It is a digital report called Because She's Powerful. And it's a report on the public health crisis, among other impacts among women with incarcerated loved ones. And so it's a really beautiful and engaging website that really does a great job of telling the story of the impacts on women with incarcerated loved ones. Another one that they did in partnership with MIT CoLab and in partnership with community groups Green Roots, City Life, and Ever Community Health Partnership is the Greater Boston Area Displacement Toolkit. And this one brought together planning and design disciplines to create a suite of aesthetic tools to support community organizing and advocacy efforts around displacement and gentrification in the Greater Boston region. So in this toolkit, there were facilitation guides and marketing materials and other things that community organizers, neighborhood groups could use with their constituents to engage on issues of gentrification and displacement. Bringing it a little closer to home to University of Oregon, Landscape for Humanity is a project that was co-founded by Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture Yagang Ko and Assistant Professor of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Studies Corey Russell, along with other faculty and students starting in 2019. Landscape for Humanity offers students a chance to broaden their design education with dynamic experiential learning projects while delivering on the initiative's promise to be a positive force on the side of social and environmental justice. And one of the projects of Landscape for Humanity is a collaboration with Opportunity Village, a transitional microhousing community for unhoused individuals in Eugene. They have 30 tiny house units. And so in working with Opportunity Village, they noted that with climate change contributing to more frequent heat waves, especially in the Pacific Northwest, the Landscape for Humanity team co-created a sustainable living forest with hundreds of trees and planters to provide shade and green amenities for the residents. And then they also created a pilot on-site gray water filtration system for the planters that allows for more sustainable irrigation for the tree growth and minimizes utility costs and the burden on residents. And that's just one of the projects that this group is doing. They have a lot of really cool things that they're focused on. Another one from UO is the Environmental Justice Research Repository. This is a digital collection serving as a repository of research materials related to the history of environmental racism in the Eugene Springfield community. It was done in partnership with nonprofit Beyond Toxics. This was done by Professor Maddie Burkert's Digital Humanities capstone course. But what I think Professor Burkert did really well, or really intriguingly in this project, is that she actually had a lower division digital humanities course, who one of their learning goals was digital assets management and responsibility and ethics around that. So that group did the somewhat tedious but really important labor of cataloging images, newspaper articles, other assets, getting the permissions for them, noting where to locate them, all that kind of labor all together, that the upper division capstone course was then able to build on that data and turn those assets into multiple really rich projects that are public facing. So the EJ Research Repository is actually only one project from that course. There's others and you can find them on our website as well. And I think this was a really great example of using the limitations of the quarter model, or if you want to think about it, using strength of multiple turn stacking to do a richer project that worked really well for their community partner. And then the last one I want to highlight is Mount Hood Stories. This is a digital storytelling project where you will find research conducted by graduate students in Professor Sarah Wald's University of Oregon graduate seminar, Racial Ecologies, in collaboration with BARC and also the UO Library Streamlab. And the goal of this course was to tell stories that provide new or alternative ways for advocates, users, and land managers for Mount Hood National Forest to grapple with Mount Hood's past, presence, and futures. And so it's all graduate level work, these really beautiful visualizations, maps, storytelling projects, research essays that get at different aspects of thinking about Mount Hood. So transitioning from there, I want to tell you about this Partnership Pedagogy website, which has a lot of really great resources for supporting you if you are interested in doing this kind of research and teaching. I call it a faculty toolkit for justice-oriented research and teaching with community partners. You can see the URLs on there. It's also going to be posted on the website. I've also got it on the last slide. So if you're frantically writing, don't panic. And then also it's if you Google U Oregon Partner Pedagogy, it will come up. So it's very findable. So you come to the first page of this, you'll sort of find all the resources. And it was originally visioned that it would be a digital publication of some kind of like a small book. And so you can come and just sort of go through it page by page, subject by subject, and it will make sense. It'll hold together. But the strength of it being a website is that you can actually pop around and dig into the subjects that are most interest to you, most used to you at the time. So the first section I want to draw attention to is the definitions and research base. You'll notice that the subjects there are community engaged learning, participatory action research, and service learning. So this gives a bit of a deeper dive into those definitions and the literature underscoring them that I gave at the top of the presentation. So it's a way to get a little more information about those three subjects. Under ethics and methodologies, this is sort of a combination of theory and framing, but then also sort of practical advice for doing this work. So working with communities gives a lot of advice and food for thought for how to build these partnerships, things to be cautious of or thoughtful of when working with communities. There's also a section on working with students, and that's both guidance for working with students, setting students up for success in doing this kind of work with community partners, cautions around preparing students to work with communities and for supporting students with marginalized and minoritized identities to do this work. So a lot of rich things there around students. Community-based digital work products arose from the fact that while there are lots of ways to do projects for community partners, a lot of what tends to come out are digital projects, as you saw from the examples I gave. Certainly not all, but it's really common for folks to want a website or an archive or a podcast or something like that. So there are sort of unique things to consider when doing digital projects, and that kind of unpacks some of those. And then the last piece here is a very, very high level primer on abolitionist and decolonial methodologies, either or both of which can be really productive lenses for thinking about this work. So it's just sort of a little taster and then some recommendations for other research that one can do if you wanted to dig into those. And then teaching resources is meant to be the really practical stuff, the things that like help you get going and be really useful. And so with that, I'm actually going to stop sharing and pop over to the website because that's a better way of showing you what's there. Okay, is that up now? Perfect. Okay. So the first page, project ideas and recommended tools, is kind of a deeper version of the little taster I gave you about project inspiration. It's sort of that on steroids. So it's meant to be examples of people who are doing this work at different levels, different scales, whole teams, single student projects of different kinds that you can use for inspiration, for thinking about what's possible. We've got public history and storytelling, audio projects, visualization and mapping projects, community action and organizing projects, visual arts, graphic novels and zines, digital archives. And then it kind of wraps up with a little section on digital tools. You'll see we have sort of UO approved tools. So for anybody at the University of Oregon, these are ones where the UO has a subscription to this service. We are already pre-enabled to use it with students, don't need to ask for any additional permissions. So those are what is available. There's also other tools which might be great for the project you're planning. There's just some other guidance that you'll need to think about with them, and you can find that in the working with students section. And then open access image sites similarly. So some other resources you can think about using. The next one is learning goals. So these are learning goals that I encourage you to still adapt, make use of, and draw inspiration from for thinking about the kind of projects you might craft for students in partnership with community members. Other resources just has kind of a range of things that can be potentially useful. This first section is all UO focused. Different both support things like research compliance services and the teaching engagement program, archives, different things that can be useful depending on what you want to be working on. And then partnership resources, some of the stuff is worksheets and templates that you can sort of take and use in your conversations with community partners and establishing those agreements that you want. Others are guides or food for thought. And so this is meant to be just really practical, getting started stuff. And then the fourth thing here is a syllabi reading list. Several faculty were really generous enough to share the reading list on their syllabi for these kind of courses. If that's useful for you to find a class similar to yours or a subject matter similar to yours, there's a lot of suggestions here. And then the last thing I wanted to showcase is if you, under definitions and research base, you can kind of see when I hover over these, you get a little drop down. Under PAR, there's another little nested page, and this is the getting started page. And here there's sort of some questions for reflection that are designed to be really useful when you're just barely thinking about this work and thinking about what you have to offer, what you're passionate about, what you might be thinking about. And then also some food for thought. And again, this is meant to be, sort of reflective, but also really practical for getting started with this kind of work and getting engaged with it. So pop back over to the slides. Okay, does that look good, Rachel? Thumbs up.
Sarah, you're in the presenter mode instead of the presentation mode. Can you switch modes? Perfect.
Okay. So I'm almost done. I want to close with this quote from Tara McPherson, and she writes, "We need new hybrid practitioners, artist theorists, programming humanists, activist scholars, theoretical archivists, critical race coders." And I love the way that McPherson is framing this as our students are entering a world where it is often not going to be sufficient to just be one thing, and that the world is going to call for people to wear, is already calling for people to wear multiple hats, and that doing this kind of deep engaged work with community partners is one way to begin thinking about, the power of those multiple hats and of doing different things. So for just a bit of background, a lot of this work and a lot of this research comes out of the Sustainability Fellows Program, which is a program that the Office of Sustainability has been running for quite a few years now, that brings together a cohort every year of faculty who want to do community engaged learning and research. It was funded for the first few years by the UO Duck Store. And then we've been funded for the past couple of years by the Pacific Northwest Just Futures Institute. And so it's a cohort-based model. So there's some training and some engagement with peers. There's some small support funds to support faculty in doing this work. Because of the Just Futures Institute funding, we're also able to invite a few faculty from Heritage University and the Yakima Indian Reservation each year. So it's just been a wonderful partnership to get to work with them. And I have at least one more year of funding. So if you're a UO faculty who's interested in this for next year, definitely please hit me up and I'm happy to talk to you about it. And then by way of closing, I just want to give this framing around thinking about this work as work towards the future that we want to build. And so I love this quote from Adrienne Marie Brown, who's sort of a multi-hyphenate, raconteur, artist, public intellectual, activist, creator. And they write in their book, Emergent Strategy, "I would call our work to change the world science fictional behavior, being concerned with the way our actions and beliefs now, today, will shape the future, tomorrow, and the next generations." And one reason I like this framing is that oftentimes the people who are in the trenches of care, organizing, service, planning, they're doing future focused work. They are thinking about how their work is trying to make the world a better place down the road for the constituencies and the issues that they're working on. The other part is that for me, higher ed is fundamentally future focused work, whether that is the research that extends existing knowledge and carries it forward into the future and pushes forward what we understand and know to be true, or whether it's on our teaching and mentorship of students, where we're educating, professionalizing, inspiring, mentoring the next generation of people who will inherit this world. There's inherently a future-focused function to higher education work. And I find that sort of a productive and inspirational way to think about the value of this work, sort of shaping the future. And hopefully that resonates with some of you as well. So I will say thank you so much. Thank you to Professor Donato for inviting me, to the Just Futures Institute, and to the NEH for having me talk to you today.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. This was super helpful, and already answered a bunch of the questions that I had written down. But maybe we can just talk for a couple minutes. I wondered if you could just talk a little bit, and I also want to put in a plug for the Sustainability Fellows Program. It was amazing. I did it a couple of years ago, and so hope it can continue beyond the one extra year of funding. Sarah, can you talk a little bit about if you want to get started, the Pedagogy website had all those great resources, and I'm wondering if that addresses things like how do you find a community partner to work with?
Oh, that's such a good question. It does a little bit in the that getting started with PAR kind of nested page that I highlighted, because one of their sort of the goals of those reflection questions is sort of, thinking about your expertise, right? Your research area, your scholarship, and what you teach. But then kind of thinking about like, what does that have to offer somebody else? So there's that component of connecting your expertise to problems that exist in the real world that might need help solving. Not to say I hate the academy is not the real world thing, so I'm not trying to make that distinction, but to the work that folks in nonprofits and organizing and government, et cetera, are doing. So there's that component. And then the other piece is thinking about what you're passionate about, like what kind of work outside of scholarship you are interested in supporting or engaging with, whether that's subject matters, whether that's certain populations, et cetera, et cetera. And so it does have some of that function of sort of filtering down from I'd like to do community engaged learning to getting a little more focus on where you might want to reach out. It does also have some resources for having those initial conversations with community partners, but kind of at a pretty high level. So yeah, now you're making me think, well, maybe we need another page that says how to get, how to reach out to somebody or how to find somebody. And I would say too, if you're at the University of Oregon, I don't know everything that everybody's doing, but feel free to reach out to me and say, hey, I saw Beyond Toxics was on your list of folks that someone's working with. I'm curious about working with them. What do you know about that? And I'm happy to, or I'm interested in working in environmental conservation, something. Do you know anybody who can work with? So I'm happy to be a resource for that. But yeah, I think some of it is like narrowing down to what you want to focus on. And then whether that's Googling, utilizing your network, et cetera, as a way to reach out. The other thing is that with the fellows program, as you know, we start out with this 3-day workshop that's sort of focused on pedagogy and then possible matching with potential community partners based on what the folks are interested in that year. And I always describe that to both the faculty and to the partners as speed dating. And so the idea is that you just meeting each other real quick. No one's promising anybody anything. And then can decide to ask the other party out for a second date if it feels like there's a spark there. And I think that's a useful way of thinking about getting started with this work too, which is brainstorm and or research who are the groups working on the area that you either feel like you have something to offer or that you want to get involved in. And then set up initial conversations with the idea being that it's just a coffee. It's not a confirmed commitment as yet, because you are trying to find out if it is a person you want to work with, if they have needs that you can support, if they have timing right now, if you have timing right now. It's kind of thinking of it that way as well.
Great. Yeah, I love that speed dating thing. It was really helpful to think about that. Sarah, are there common mistakes that you would, off the top of your head, kind of let people know, things to be careful about?
Yeah, I think one is this is why it is useful when you're especially if there's a specific group that you really want to work with, a specific organization that you really want to work with. It is good to do some asking around initially, because there are, especially in Eugene, but I'm sure it's probably true everywhere, there are certain nonprofits that get pinged so much with new requests to engage that they mostly just ignore them at this point. Like they're overtaxed with requests to come talk to my class or come do a thing or, can we come volunteer with you? And so asking around through your networks, other folks at the UO, who are those people who get tasked a lot, can be one way to build ins and see like, okay, well that group's clearly getting plenty of support. I should think about another one. So that's one. And then I think the other part goes back to that caution I gave in the presentation about, again, really thinking about this as relationship building and mutually beneficial. And I do mean the mutually. Obviously, there needs to be value for your students or value for your research. Like you have to be getting something out of this, but the goal is really that it be something that the community partner actually really wants and needs. And that dance of figuring out what that is one of those things that takes a little bit of time, and keeping in mind that their concerns and what they're interested in achieving are going to be different than yours until you have enough conversations to figure out where you have common ground.
Yeah, great, thanks. Sarah, are there obviously the Sustainability Office, you have this tremendous resource, and with the website, are there other partners you work with on campus that people should know about? Or
Yeah, want to shout out, obviously, the Provost Office of the Provost Environment Initiative, which is really supporting faculty research collaborations and is really supportive of community engaged research and learning and of fostering those kinds of engagements. So the Environment Initiative is one. The Teaching Engagement Program has a lot of great resources and are really happy to, if you reach out and ask them questions and things like that to support, especially the pedagogical side of things. Also, research compliance services or I think it's research development services now. If you're doing research, they have already drafted some documents that you can use to set up productive working agreements with community partners. And the Pacific Northwest Just Future Institute has worked really deeply with them to have those documents be readable by normal people and not just read like legal contracts and things like that. And so they have some resources already available that are really good for codifying, but in a way that's meant to protect and support both parties in the work, the relationships between community partners. So I think they're a really good group to engage with, especially if you're at the I'm going to do a thing phase. Another thing, it's more a caution, but I'm thinking of it now as we're talking about this, is speaking of the research piece. Oftentimes, or not oftentimes, folks start out with a class, and then because it's really cool, or because it launches into something that's like we're studying further with students or other things, there's a desire to turn that into a research project. But you can run into research compliance issues if you didn't get sort of the IRB approval out the gate. And so even at a classroom level, if there's any chance that you can say that this might turn into a research project that needs IRB approval, you might get the ball rolling on that out the gate, so that you don't lose the opportunity to turn that into research down the road. Even if it's not your initial plans, if there's any chance of it, that's a good one to do out the gate. So that you have that door open to you should you want to walk through it.
Great. And is there stuff on the pedagogy website about the IRB stuff? Is that?
Yeah, there's a bit of content that sort of says this is something you should think about.
Yeah.
And then under the resources page, there are links out to the specific University of Oregon offices that do those things to do the deeper dive. And the IRB site has actually a really good, almost like a flowchart form where you can plug in information about the project that you're thinking of, and it will pop out and be like, you do need IRB approval for this, or no, you don't. And so they've got some useful tools on that site.
Okay, great. That's great. Yeah. Any other last comments, Sarah, before we wrap it up? Or
yeah, I'll say, I feel like oftentimes I have these conversations or I do these kinds of presentations, and I hope folks aren't feeling this way who are watching this, but I feel like sometimes, or I worry sometimes that the feeling is like, oh my gosh, that sounds really hard and scary and I don't want to do it. Now that I've heard you give this presentation, and I would say, I hope people aren't feeling that way. I hope folks are feeling inspired. But if you are feeling a little bit of that overwhelm or caution, I think those cautions are important to have going in, but I'm so passionate about the power of this work for students and the value that it can bring to them. And also just the deep importance of universities thinking outside our insular interests and thinking about that again, like how are we contributing to the world that we want to build? And so I hope people do feel really encouraged, even if it's dipping a toe in. You don't have to do everything whole hog. You can start out small. And I love supporting this and talking about this, so I am happy to chat with anyone who's curious about this at any time.
great. And I'm really thankful. So I remember you suggested the kind of starting small thing, and I had Beyond Toxics come and give a talk in my Japanese environmental film class, and it was just really amazing for just getting students to think about what's happening here, in their own backyards, as opposed to what's happening, across the Pacific Ocean. So yeah, and so really great to remember there are some of those dipping toe in small lift things that can get people started, and it can be really transformational. So
yeah, and I'll say too, I love that is an entry point kind of option, or a dipping toe in option, especially if you have the means to pay the community partner for their time and expertise, which we really emphasize in the workshop as well, which, as I say, that I realize we haven't really discussed so far. So one reason I like that is like, yes, if you can compensate for people for their time and expertise, please do so. Find a way to do it. Look for resources to do it. It goes a long way to building trusting relationships when you respect people's time financially as well as verbally. The other thing about that, thinking of as a lower hanging fruit option, is that it is recognizing them as experts, as opposed to going back to that notion of just volunteering. That still kind of has a model of us helping them, that kind of rather icky and condescending approach, which some people who do volunteering are probably so mad at me right now. I think there can be value there, but just be cautious about it. Where having someone come in and speak to your class, you're saying, I recognize you as an expert with professional information to convey to my class. And I think that's just a different dynamic, bringing folks in as experts that can be really valuable.
And then I think was great too, it can also open the door to then students doing volunteer or some kind of work with that organization in the future. So yeah, it was great. So
yeah, internships, potentially jobs after graduation.
Yeah, perfect. So
yeah,
great. I just want to thank you so much, Sarah, for putting together this amazing amount of information for us and pointing us to these websites. And this will be posted on our NEH site, and your contact information is there if people want to get in touch with you. I'm gonna say thank you and stop the recording here.
Thank you so much.